So good day and welcome to another episode of Cuppa with the Jesuit. I'm Father Robin Koning, the Provincial Assistant for Vocations for the Australian Jesuits.
I'm Julian Butler, a Jesuit scholastic in formation, and Father Robin and I are joined today from Alice Springs by Father Brian McCoy. Father Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Julian. It's a long way from Melbourne, a long way from lockdowns, and as you can see from the country behind me, I'm heading tomorrow into the dry country of Central Australia, further into that. I don't have a formal shirt with me. I have my cup, which I've just brewed some coffee to help me on the journey tomorrow. And of course, one must have a good hat and one must take sunblock. So I'm almost ready to go tomorrow, heading west, borders permitting, across the Tanami to an old place where I lived for many years with Robin also, to the communities of the Gudjonka region, about 850 kilometres west of Alice Springs. And I hope to head off tomorrow.
Yeah, Brian, as you said, we were there together up at the Gudjonka region back in the 90s. And that was, for me, the beginning of working with Aboriginal people. For you, it was an ongoing part of a long journey. Would you like to say a bit about your work and engagement with Aboriginal people over the years?
Well, it's a long history. When I grew up in Melbourne, I had learned very little, if pretty well nothing about Aboriginal people. So when I left school, it was a big gap in my life. And as a young Jesuit, I was invited to join a camp at Lake Tyers, which is in Victoria, with two other young Jesuit scholastics, and that summer of around 1970. And so that introduction to Aboriginal people at a very young age just showed me how much of my life in this country I did not know. And so that led me on a journey over more than 50 years of living and working in different communities here. Being privileged to visit Indigenous communities in other parts of the world, learning some language and culture, and with you, Robin, especially in the Western Desert, living with people there in the 90s and understanding much more about their spirituality, their culture, their relationships. So much they drew me and you into that, that has blessed me so much in my life.
There's been various aspects to your work with Indigenous people, hasn't there? In different places, different kinds of work, research, relationships, on the ground pastoral work, a whole variety of things.
Yeah, I began with pastoral work in Townsville, working with the community there, the urban community. Then in some spirituality after some work, a sabbatical with the Anishinaabe in Canada. And then I worked with the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody with Pat Dodson in Broome. And then I went into the desert with you for some years. And that led me a great concern that developed over many years of coaching football, of visiting men in prison, of being with families. Led me to a doctorate at the invitation of an Aboriginal professor at the University of Melbourne in early 2000. And that doctorate became a focus on the health of Aboriginal men based in the Western Desert, and then postdoc after that at La Trobe University. So when you put it all together, I have been a most privileged person in this country. I have a saying, I'm a better person for being a Jesuit, but I'm a better Jesuit for having been with Aboriginal people. And I believe that quite deeply. I had a medical trajectory when I was at school. My father was a physician, GP. My uncle was a surgeon. One of my sisters, a physio, another a nurse. The medical interest and love has always been there in my life. The physical, but with Ignatian spirituality, linking the physical with the spiritual. And then, of course, Aboriginal people drawing me into what it means to be both in this ancient land and the history of this ancient land and the spirit of God, the creative God, the loving God, the presence of God in this land. And over these years, I continue to learn. I continue to feel blessed for so much that people have given me, my brother Jesuits, the company I have, but also the many First Nations peoples here and overseas who have loved me, teased me, forgiven me, corrected me, and will always be my friends. I'm so grateful.
Father Brian, you mentioned growing up that you didn't have much, if any, awareness of Aboriginal Australia, and then that those relationships have made you a better Jesuit relationships with Aboriginal people. What was that initial urge to become a Jesuit, and how have those relationships shaped your vocation subsequently?
Well, as I said, I was on a trajectory to do medicine. I was accepted into medicine at the university. But in the years as I was leaving school, finishing school, we'd go out on retreat to Watsonia and we'd meet the Jesuits there, the scholastics, the young Jesuits. And I felt there was something they had, something of a spirit, of a peacefulness, of something that was missing in my life at that time. I mean, I was only 16, 17 at the time. But I felt these Jesuits held something in their spirit, in their company, that I wanted, that I sought. And with the help of another Jesuit, an older Jesuit, went through a process of discernment, and so I joined. And that's been a journey since then of deepening a sense of what Ignatian spirituality, how Ignatius leads us to Jesus, how Ignatius reveals the presence of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, the kingdom of Jesus. And Ignatius does it in a way that we are less frightened. I think at times I've felt fear about changing, crossing over, doing things, trying things. But Ignatian spirituality and the company of my brother Jesuits has always been one of encouragement to take risks, to reach out, try something new, but above all, to listen. And I think that's the great call of the nation at the moment, is not just listening to First Nations people, but listening to the cry of refugees and those seeking asylum, but listening to the land. And that's what the First Nations people teach us. But Ignatian spirituality, of course, comes to that, and it helps us. It helps remove that fear of the unknown, because God is present. You know, that lovely quote in Genesis, I think we had early this week, God is in this place and I never knew it, says Jacob. I never knew it. And I think that's been what Ignatius helped me come to Jesus, revealing the presence of the Lord, the loving God, the creative God, this mystery of creation which sits behind me and sits around us, and drawing us into that love of Jesus, that company of Jesus. Ignatius referred to being friends in the Lord, and nothing touches me so better than to feel that sense of being friends in the Lord with my brother Jesuits, and then taking that grace to be with Aboriginal people.
What was it that drew you into the initial engagement with Aboriginal peoples?
Well, there was a time in the early 1970s where there was a movement within the Society of Jesus where faith and justice needed to come together more closely. And that if we were people of faith and men of faith and a church of faith, what did it mean to be people who lived that faith with justice in the world? And so what was coming out of the church after Vatican II, was coming out of our own congregations, was the desire to seek new borders, new boundaries, new places where faith and justice could meet. And this became a clear one for me. After the camp at Lake Tyers, I was tutoring young children with ABSCOL at the university. And then this possibility of spending a time in the Western Desert arose. It was a radical idea. We're a long way from anyone else, really. It was a very isolated place 50 years ago, much less other Jesuits. But it showed me how much I didn't know. Now, here was I amongst people who spoke 1 or 2 or 3 languages before English, who'd come in from the desert. Some had walked the desert, some knew the desert, some knew people who died in the desert. And here they were coming to terms with living in a community that gathered people from all sorts of directions. And I realized I knew so little. So it drew me back. One of the great things about Ignatian spirituality, it reminds us to go back to places, if grace is being given, to keep receiving those graces. And I kept going back, and then I kept going to other places. I spent a summer at Bodere, and the Royal Commission opened up, and that was a wonderful privilege. So I have just been very blessed to have been able to respond with the support of my brother Jesuits to these places and to these moments. And I keep learning. I keep wishing our church could learn from Aboriginal people, as Pope John Paul said at Blatterscott Park in '86. He wanted the church that Jesus calls her to be, the Australian church. There can only be an Australian church if Indigenous people are making their contribution, and he said, that contribution is joyfully received by others. And I know what it is to joyfully receive their contribution. I hope the church in Australia can learn that and receive it.
Father Brian, you mentioned earlier that very deep sense that Ignatius had of being friends in the Lord, and then of being great distances, and sometimes with brother Jesuits, but sometimes alone. You've had a life that's been on the periphery. More recently in Melbourne, you've done a doctorate and spent time as the Provincial Superior of the Jesuits in Australia and New Zealand. How have you experienced that sense of being a Jesuit on the peripheries at the centre? And how have you been sustained in different places, sometimes a long way from your brother Jesuits?
One of the things we developed in the North in the 90s, we were probably the most dispersed Jesuit community in the Society of Jesus. We were spread over thousands of kilometres, but we made a commitment to meet every year for a week. And we would come together, we would pray together, we would care for each other, and we would help focus on priorities that we could share of mission wherever we went back to, urban ministry, remote ministry, whatever. And I think for me, it is those places of conversation, but Ignatius emphasized spiritual conversation. That's listening to the Spirit in oneself, but in others, and listening to that gently, trustingly, lovingly, and feeling that you are then friends in the Lord with your brother Jesuits. I mean, the great example is Francis Xavier. You know, he heads off, but he wasn't the bloke that Ignatius wanted. Ignatius had someone else in mind, and he suddenly finds this guy can't go, and Francis Xavier says, well, send me. Now, I wasn't quite Francis Xavier, but I was willing to go knowing I belonged to a company of friends. And it's wonderful when you come back and you have those conversations and you listen more deeply to the journey, because we're all on spiritual journeys, each one of us. Our whole country is on a spiritual journey. To listen to it and then to be missioned, to go out again and take the energy and the love and the hope and the encouragement from one another to those remote areas, because we're human beings and we're men, but we want to be friends in the Lord.
Brian, if a young man came to you and he was exploring this idea of being friends in the Lord with us in the Society of Jesus, what might you say to him? How much you encourage him?
I'd say go for it. I'd say, look, there's never been a time in Australian history that we need good men and women of the Spirit, people who can listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit in this land now. I believe there's a great thirst in this land for spirituality. It's a growing thirst. There's confidence in formal religion, we know that. But you see the generosity of people, you see the kindness of people, you see through the bushfires and the floods and COVID, a great heart that lives in many Australians. But many are looking for a spirit that connects, that makes sense, that they can find God in these places where they work, and some are very difficult. So Ignatius offers us, as I said before, a way to Jesus. And it is 500 years of different ways it can be done by men and women. But if a Jesuit, a young person said, I want to be a Jesuit today, I'd say, it's an exciting time. Yes, it's a difficult time. There's roadblocks, difficulties. Jesus warns us of those. But it's an exciting time because the hunger is there, the thirst is there for people to come forward and really tap into a deeper spirituality that will connect this country and this church that's now in a place of synodality. I don't think we really understand the synodality well enough, but Pope Francis encourages us to be this new church. And in fact, I think Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, they understand synodality very well in some of the ways they live, that sharing of life. So I would say great times, challenging times, but if it's in the heart, it's deep in that heart, you want to do it, you want to be part of it. You will be dispersed at times, but this company, across Asia, across the world, wonderful men and a wonderful spirituality that will sustain you. So get out there and go for it, I'd say.
That's great, Brian. And thank you very much for your time today, and all the best for your travels up the Tanami Road tomorrow with the Cuppa on, and greetings to all our friends up there.